From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Ahead today, K-State's Kraig Roozeboom will report on findings so far from a long-term study that features cover crops as a component of a wheat-sorghum-soybean rotation. He'll talk about how those cover crops influenced grain yields and impacted water use, among other factors. This study has now drawn some national attention, and he'll visit about that as well. Also today, K-State's Chris Mullenix talks with Britton Rucker about the 2019 K-State Livestock Judging Camps for 4-H and FFA youth coming up this summer. The enrollment deadline is fast approaching. And later, with Stop, Look, and Listen, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. That's what's ahead on this Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. Good to have you tuned in once again for another Agriculture Today here on the K-State Radio Network. We'll devote these next few moments to an update on a long-term cover crop research project that the Department of Agronomy here at Kansas State University has been conducting, 12 growing seasons and running, as a matter of fact. This has drawn the attention, by the way, of a national soil health organization, and we want to bring that into the conversation as well. Research agronomist at K-State, Kraig Roozeboom, has joined us once again to share all of this. Kraig, just right to that latter point, something called the Soil Health Initiative has expressed interest in this project. You might talk about it and what that level of interest is.
Right. Well, the Soil Health Initiative is one of several organizations across the country that are trying to raise the profile of soil health. Obviously, on a national agency scale, the NRCS, the USDA NRCS, has promoted soil health for several years now. Obviously fits their mandate. The Soil Health Initiative and others like it are more private organizations, although they may apply for and receive public funding. But the Soil Health Initiative per se is located, or at least has their initial base funding from the Noble Foundation in Oklahoma. And so they've got some ties to this part of the country. One of their projects that they received some funding for was to, my interpretation anyway, of their objective is to get a better handle on how to characterize soil health scientifically. And if you've been in on these conversations, everybody maybe has a slightly different definition of what soil health is.
There's a wide spectrum there, Kraig.
Right. Or they struggle with defining it even, right? And so it's hard to put a number on like you can for soil potassium parts per million or what have you. And so that's probably an oversimplified version of the objective of this project. And so where they're going about this is they put out a call about a year ago or early last summer for researchers to apply to have their long-term study as part of their sampling scheme. And so it was almost like submitting a proposal to them to say, okay, they had some criteria. It had to be in place for at least 10 years. You had to have at least one set of treatments that could potentially affect parameters that we traditionally associate with soil health. Mm-hmm. Cover crops would be kind of one that comes to mind, tillage. They've even got some of these sites that are pasture sites or range sites that may have different levels of management that in those contexts may be associated with soil health.
But the K-State proposal, again revolving around the cover crop study, was accepted then.
That's right. So we and actually Alan Schlegel out at Tribune has a longer-term study that does include some tillage components and things that's also being sampled. as part of this overall initiative. And I don't know the total number of samples, but it's a North American initiative, so they've got sites down into Mexico and up into Canada and all across the U.S., across the broad spectrum of cropping systems. I mentioned range and pasture sites. And so it's going to have a lot of data points. They do have also some of their criteria involved. They're looking at replicated studies, so they're not just parachuting into some this versus that. It's got to have some scientific rigor behind the experimental setup, and so that's one of the things I appreciated about their approach. They've hired a number of project scientists to then go out and carry out the sampling across sections of the U.S., so the individuals who sampled our site is also sampling another 10 or 12 sites throughout the Central Great Plains, for instance.
Well, this is a strong testimony to the merits of the research that's been going on for 11 years and now into the 12th year here at Kansas State University. And part of what we wanted to do as well is remind folks of the orientation of that cover crop research and then where it stands today.
Right. So, as you say, we're going into our 12th growing season. It's a 3-year rotation with wheat, sorghum, and soybeans. And between the wheat and the sorghum, so wheat would come off or be harvested in June. Sorghum doesn't get planted until the next May. That was our initial window for inserting cover crops or double crops. We have a double crop soybean treatment as one of the points of comparison to intensify that system. And from initially, the whole idea was intensifying and diversifying that system, and then this whole soil health discussion kind of came along over the course of the past 10 to 12 years. And so we've run 3 cycles of that rotation now, right? Three-year cycles that brought us through 9 years, and since we have every phase of that rotation present every year, it's actually staggered out, to get that third phase through 3 cycles. We just finished that up last year, essentially. And we're in the process of pulling all of that data together over those first 3 cycles. We've got one publication out already on that with a graduate student of Dr. Tomlinson. I think I've come in and talked previously about his focus was on greenhouse gas emissions. We're continuing some of that work. It's complex. It's not just a simple answer to say cover crops reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, they do if they're there growing, but then maybe there are other things going on after you terminate them. And so that's a complex discussion. That's tied also to nitrogen cycling and fertilization management, and we've developed some information about how fertilization can be adjusted in sorghum with and without cover crops. And then now it's actually on a bit of a hold, but our intent is to summarize the whole entire system yield and economic data from that to look at the interaction then of the additional expenses associated with intensification relative to changes in returns from crop yields and sales and things like that. The first cut at this is that in this system where we're just leaving the cover crops in place, we're not grazing, double crop soybeans, anything that includes the double crop soybeans tends to have a greater economic return, as you can imagine, even though it's a bit risky. At least you've got the potential to get some cash return in any given year. It also has provided, at least on the initial sampling that we've done, some of the same soil health type benefits that we often discuss, like improved soil organic carbon and the potentially associated, and that's some of what we're going to get at with this intense sampling that we just discussed with the Soil Health Institute. Associated with our organic carbon would be things like soil structure, aggregate size, water infiltration, things like that. That's our preliminary summary from that first 3 cycles. As I said, we're formalizing those results into a publication form, and that'll be coming out over the next few months.
Now, we need to identify what you're comparing double crop soybeans to as far as other cover crops, or are you looking at other?
We are. The base system is wheat, sorghum, soybeans. Just spray out any weeds and volunteer wheat that come up between wheat and sorghum planting. We call that our chemical fallow check. It's all no-till. Hasn't been any tillage since 2007 on the site. Double crop soybeans is almost another check, but it is another version of intensification where we plant soybeans after wheat harvest them for grain. There have been 1 or 2 years where we've gotten nothing or next to nothing. There have been years we had 40 or 50 bushel soybeans. Hence the potential anyway for greater cash return.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So those are kind of the two base systems, and those two treatments are being sampled in this soil health initiative sampling that we talked about. They don't have the resource to sample every plot in the study, so those two were sampled because they've been consistent throughout the lifetime of that study. Then we've had other cover crops inserted after wheat planting: summer legume, summer non-legume, winter legumes, winter non-legumes. Most of them have been fairly consistent, like the winter non-legume has always been a brassica, like radishes. I think a couple of years we had canola, but very similar. The summer legume has always been a late-maturing soybean. Doesn't get harvested for grain. It's not setting pods until September, but then once it starts to set pods, we terminate it. The summer non-legume has always been a sorghum sedan, high biomass. Typically, we can get almost as good a yields out of sorghum after that, but it takes more nitrogen because that heavy mat of biomass tends to tie up nitrogen. And so there are a lot of things going on with these. Let's see, the last one would be a winter legume, and that's the one that's probably changed the most over the years just because we've found it hard to settle on a winter legume that establishes well, survives well, gets on enough growth. It's been less consistent than the other treatments. In recent years, we've had a crimson clover, red clover combination, those things.
With us right here, K-State Cropping Systems agronomist Kraig Roozeboom. Kraig bringing us up to date on this long-term rotational cover crop field trial that he's been overseeing the past dozen years now. We'll have him share more of his observations on this work after this break. This is Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
This is Agriculture Today, and again in the guest chair this first half hour, K-State research agronomist Kraig Roozeboom. Kraig's in charge of a multi-year study of cover crop performance within a wheat, grain, sorghum, soybean crop rotation. The cover crop grown following wheat harvest through grain sorghum planting that following spring, and for a variety of purposes: erosion control, weed control, soil improvement. This work has drawn the attention of the Soil Health Institute, which will be extracting data from this research as well on the effects on soil health. An assortment of cover crop types have been employed within this rotation, as Kraig told us, including double crop soybeans after wheat, brassica stands, among others. Now, Kraig, there are a few more aspects of your research findings to date that we wanted to cover here, including how soil water availability is impacted by the inclusion of the cover crop in this rotation. That earns attention, and deservedly so, the water use factor with these cover crops. Presumably you've been tracking that.
We are, and in many ways the yield of that subsequent crop tells us a lot about water use, right? Okay. And we've got a range of nitrogen treatments on that sorghum. We can kind of separate out the nitrogen effect, potential nitrogen effect, from any potential water shortage effects. And for a couple of seasons, we actually did insert neutron access tubes so we could use a neutron probe to assess soil profile moisture. When we did that, we found that, yes, these cover crops double crop soybeans are using water. And you could have water extraction, especially from these brassicas like radishes with the strong taproot, down to 8 or 9 feet in that profile. And they would persist. But by the time we got to sorghum planting the next spring, in the 2 years we had the tubes in the ground, they were terminated the previous fall or they died out over the winter, had minimal spring growth. That soil profile had recharged. Our yield data would say minimal impact on yield. If we applied enough nitrogen, our yields were no different than if we were in the chemical fallow system. And so, that agrees with kind of our yield data over the years. Yeah, we're using water, but in our system, in this environment, it tends to recharge. Now, it's a very different story as you move west, where they don't have as much rainfall, what have you, so you factor that in.
Have to factor last year in, too, though, do you not? Because extraordinarily dry, as all know. What was the readout on water use at that point? Right.
Last year, and so we're talking fall of 17 through the spring and early summer of 18. Very dry winter, very dry spring, dry up through June and into early July, if I remember right. I'd have to look at the information. But at least at our location, that was basically the pattern. And so we were out doing some profile sampling there just before sorghum sampling, and even then we could tell those were much drier where we had a cover crop in place. And what had changed is, I mentioned, we had the same set of treatments for 3 cycles. After that, we figured, okay, we've looked at those treatments a fair bit. We've got a 36-month rotation. We're only changing things for about 4 to 5 months out of that 36-month period. Let's push it a little harder. And so now we're adding additional cover crops in the spring. So we converted a couple of those summer legume things to double crop soybeans because that was giving us our better return. But then we would add another cover crop in the spring ahead of sorghum planting, in this case oats. So you plant that early, get about 50 to 60 days of growth, kill it, plant the sorghum, go. And then we did that in the fall of 16 through the spring of 17, and it behaved much like we'd seen with our previous treatments. We got enough rain, the sorghum caught up, and especially if we put enough nitrogen on, the sorghum yields were no different than if they did not have those spring cover crops in place. That was the spring of 17. Spring of 18, I just mentioned the very dry winter, very dry spring. If we had that spring cover crop in place, our sorghum yields were half of what anything else was. Even just double crop soybeans actually pulled down sorghum yields a little bit without that additional spring cover crop in place because that dry period reached all the way back to last fall or that previous fall. And so that's the scenario that everybody is worried about, and it can happen. I will say, out of 12 years, that was the one year we saw that happen. We'll see as we continue this intensified set of treatments to see how consistently that happens. This spring, it's a little hard to say how it's going to turn out because our planting of those spring cover crops was delayed because of the cool, wet winter and spring. So you'd think we have enough soil moisture to sustain that, but it's going to be emerging later. Maybe we'll see how much growth we get. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out this year. So all that to say is, yeah, we've demonstrated that you can grow cover crops out there in our environment. Generally, we recharge by that following spring, but there are years where it can hurt us. And whether that's again, as we look at the over years analysis of economics, I think that'll help us sort out how big a deal that really is.
And that's coming.
And that's forthcoming. I will say that in many other environments, or even in our environment, if you've got the additional grazing component, then all of a sudden cover crops have a much better economic picture as well. And other researchers are looking at that at other locations. But those are scenarios where you can get many of the same soil health types of benefits, but then the additional economic return of cattle gain, say, or maintenance. And so That's not a component of this study, but I think in reality, when you look across the landscape, people who are using cover crops on an ongoing basis generally have some kind of a grazing component to make it work.
Well, this body of work that's been going on for now a dozen years, counting this year as well, is rendering some good information for producers to weigh as far as the agronomic considerations of cover crops and the additional factors that you just mentioned, including grazing. So the future, if you will, looks optimistic for the utilization of these cover crop types in our rotations, Kraig.
It does in some ways. In other ways, as the economics has gotten tighter on crop production, it gets harder to spend that extra X dollars an acre and time and fuel to put out and plant, buy the seed, put it out there, run the machinery across it. And so there are competing pressures on it. But as we mentioned, you've got, I think, a greater awareness of the potential for soil health benefits, whatever you may call that or however you may characterize it. There's something good about having stuff growing out there in general. A large driver of that is just weed suppression and weed population management as we deal with these herbicide-resistant populations out there. Dr. Dilley has probably been over to talk about that, but that's one of her major areas of research. So those are a couple of drivers. The other is the livestock grazing. Folks call it cover crops or really annual forages, but maybe we're quibbling about semantics. Regardless, that's a valuable resource. And again, if you think about it in terms of and manage it appropriately, you can gain the soil health benefits in that context as well. I think one of the things we're showing is that a double crop system, and we're looking at soybeans, but I think there are other options out there. People grow double crop sorghum or corn or sunflowers in various parts of the state where you're intensifying that system that way. You've got the potential for economic return, but again, you're still gaining that carbon fixation, gaining having that cover out there, and some of the other cropping system benefits as well.
Well, it's work that has garnered the attention of the Soil Health Initiative, as we talked about earlier, which is a feather in the cap of this research and its importance. And we always appreciate the update on what you're working on in this area, Kraig. Many thanks to you, and good luck in further pursuing this.
Thank you, Eric. Glad to do it.
Kraig Roozeboom is a research agronomist here at Kansas State University, and that's a quick look at where they stand with the ongoing cover crop research that's being conducted and what kind of information that work is rendering to the benefit of producers who might be contemplating cover crops as part of their regular crop rotations. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We've a brief moment ahead of the break, so we'd bring to your attention one more time our podcast service. If you'd like to subscribe to the podcast version, simply go to agtoday.net. The podcast is stored there, and if you tap the subscribe button, brand new episodes of the broadcast will automatically arrive on your device every weekday. More and more folks are taking advantage of this listening option. We'd invite you to do the same if you're so inclined. Start by going to agtoday.net. In a few moments, we'll hand it on over to Britton Rucker and her guest. You're tuned to the K-State Radio Network.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. I'm Britton Rucker. As summer is well approaching, it's time to be thinking of those summer activities for youth to be involved in. And K-State is once again offering a livestock judging camp for 4-H and FFA members. With me now is K-State Livestock Judging Coach Chris Molinex. Chris, this camp is all based around these kids who are seriously interested in enhancing their livestock judging and oral communication skills.
Yeah, it's exciting and a great opportunity to have young people on campus during the summer months, introduce them to the K-State culture, so to speak. But absolutely, we really look forward to working with these young people because they have a passion for the livestock industry and in particular in improving their skills in the livestock judging arena.
And you personally will be out there teaching these camps.
Yeah, so we host three-day camps, of which I play a big role in coaching during those camps, but we also take advantage of utilizing some of the community college instructors across the state that are also outstanding in this discipline and coaching nationally recognized teams at the community college level. And then we also use our current students. So those that are currently members of our livestock judging team take a huge role in serving kind of as peer mentors, so to speak, for those young people that are here as part of the camp.
Now, what all will these kids be exposed to?
So during the 3 days, we cover all species, major species of livestock. So we will spend 1 day focusing on beef cattle, 1 day focusing on swine, and the final day focusing on sheep and meat goats. So we get an opportunity to go to several different locations. We work very closely with school farms in particular to view livestock, but we'll also go to a couple of operations outside of the university that allow us to view some of their livestock as well. But we have a focus on all species and kind of giving them a well-rounded opportunity to expand their evaluation skills. But I would say probably the single biggest thing that we focus on during the camp is their development and oral reasons. And that's a big part of competition for those that aren't exposed or have a great deal of background in livestock judging. I think one of the most important traits, characteristics that it helps to develop in young people is oral communication skills. And in competition, they are asked to stand in front of an industry, a leader or official, and kind of articulate their thoughts as to why they placed a class of livestock in the fashion that they chose. And in order to do so effectively, they've got to know a lot about the livestock, but they also have to develop their communication ability and be able to do it in a convincing fashion. And that's one of the things that we try to focus on during those 3 days is giving them a pretty intense opportunity to develop those skills and lots of repetition. Most of our camps will have at least 8 to 12 coaches that are part of it, so we get a chance to break them down into small groups. They get a lot of one-on-one time and a lot of opportunity to advance that skill.
Now, you have quite a range of kids, and I'm sure different experiences with that. Do you break them up age-wise or experience?
A little of both. So our age bracket is 14 and up. We understand that there needs to be some maturity to be involved with this camp. If nothing else, they're staying in a dorm for a couple of nights, and we didn't know that they're ready to handle those kind of things. But as we work through that first day, we kind of get a feel for where each young person is in terms of level of experience, and we try to group them accordingly. I think that's one of the big benefits of our camp is regardless of whether you're relatively early in livestock judging or maybe preparing for national 4-H or FFA competition, it still gives every one of those students a chance to advance their skills to another level. And we'll have young people that have attended our camp 3 or 4 consecutive years. And I think they would tell you each year they get something new out of it. And I think the reason is because we have such great help and the ability to break them down into groups primarily according to experience level. When we do that, now we can help those maybe less experienced start at a different level, whereas those that are ready to go to the highest of levels, we don't have to dummy it down, so to speak, to get them started. We can start right at their level and move forward. And at the same token, for those young people that are less experienced, we're not speaking over their heads yet either. We can start at their level and help them progress to wherever they need to during those 3 days. So it's a little bit of both. The age probably is reflected in those groups a little bit, but we try to really get a feel for where their level of experience is also.
Now, walking through the daily schedule, what these kids will experience.
Typically, even June, early June can be hot, so we try to view livestock in the mornings most of the time when it's still reasonably cool. The first day of camp actually doesn't start until after lunch. We check them in and we start immediately after lunch, and we'll do some lecture material during that afternoon, primarily during the heat of that day. And then that evening, we'll spend some time out at our brand new purebred beef center, working through some of our replacement heifers. And then that evening, we typically go off campus, and when it cools down, to get a chance to see some additional cattle classes. But the other 2 days, we start as early as we can. We get them through Derby and get breakfast in them, and we try to hit the road so that we can be viewing hogs, sheep, goats, while it's still relatively cool in the morning so we don't overwork livestock. And the afternoons are pretty heavy with classroom time, and in particular working on their reason skills. We try on that second evening to give them a little bit of a break, and we'll go down to the Union and do a little bowling or shoot some pool, or just try to have some fun with them so they can get just a little break from the action. But we keep it pretty tight, and we know that they come here for a reason, and we want to make sure we give them every opportunity to advance their skill set.
Now, you mentioned there's 3 camps. What are the dates for those?
Our first camp will be June 3rd to the 5th. The second is the 11th through the 13th, and then our final camp runs the 15th to the 17th. Those are the dates that they'll hit this summer.
Where would you go to register for this camp?
Anybody that's interested, if you just jump onto the K-State website, our animal science webpage, or even just go to a search engine and type in KSU Livestock Judging Camp. We call it Champions Camp. But if you go to any Google search or anything, it should take you straight to our animal science website. And then right within the site, we've got a fillable PDF registration form that you can get sent back to us. And this year the cost is $300 per camper for those 3 days. And in that cost, a big portion of that cost is our dorm fees and our meal costs. All of the meals are covered during their time here at camp, along with a few souvenirs to go home with at the end of their 3 days. It's still pretty cost efficient for all the things that they leave here with, but anybody that's interested can go straight to the Animal Science website.
Well, Chris, this sounds like a fantastic camp for 4-H and FFA members to get involved with and not only sharpen their livestock judging skills, but as well as being a well-rounded communicator. Thanks for being here.
No problem. Enjoyed it.
That was Chris Molinex, livestock judging coach here at Kansas State University. I'm Britton Rucker, and we'll be back with more after this break over the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
One can have lots of ideas, good ideas, but a budget to carry out ideas is necessary.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
Casually glancing at the obituaries, I certainly stopped when I read the name of a friend. I read again and looked at the photograph. Yes, it was him, all right. It came as a shock, but not really, as the last time I saw him, he had aged. I read he was 90 years old, a beautiful age. I hope I can say that when I reach it. As friends go, I do call him a friend, even though we were not fishing or golfing buddies. At one time, he was my boss. I respected him. To me, he was not bossy, but I knew and understood he never liked bull. He had no time for it, nor have I. I hold very good memories. The memory held close was the fact that when he retired, a long time ago, they built a house on an interesting piece of land, with character. And then, asked me to please drop by if I was in the neighborhood to give them advice with landscaping the house and make it fit. The house stood quite bare on a hill. I did stop by, and we walked around the house, and I made suggestions what to plant, where and why. They took notes and followed up. As I remember, they had a planned budget. That, of course, is the start. One can have lots of ideas, good ideas, but a budget to carry out ideas is necessary, especially if one starts with a bare house. Even putting in a lawn is not cheap. I remember walking around the dwelling after eating a fantastic homemade sandwich with a big glass of milk. To remember all this is not too difficult, because when I retired, I received a handmade booklet with colorful photos of their property with handwritten notes describing the notes taken and plants planted and now grown. And that was the year 2000. The booklet has always laid in front in my bookcase, close by, and I've picked it up quite regularly. It reminded me of what I've said and preached all the time, that landscaping, good landscaping, you can call it functional landscaping, pays off. It's not an expense. It's an investment which gives returns. Not only when you sell your property, but while you live there, you yourself feel and see the benefits as you move outside. Here, in our own yard, the bur oak I planted as a small tree 30 years ago is now an impressive shade tree. It's doing what I planted it for. Right now, the opening leaves are squirrel's ears. But as spring moves forward, the leaves will develop and provide the needed shade in the afternoon. Not only that, but it is a beautiful tree. So, it was with interest I looked at the photos to see how plants had matured and how a landscape had developed. I left the notes with the photos of a few shrubs growing along the side of the house. Note, not too close against the house. The handwritten note, peonies, large evergreen to hide the deck, just as you said it would, and spirea. I know I selected hardy plant material, as failure of plants to grow because they're not adapted is extremely disappointing after the effort of planting. One can always add those few plants which hold special meaning and try them. I have a shrub growing under the blooming redbuds, which I remember grew in our garden when I was a small child. I placed it so that I see it daily, and it reminds me of a long time ago, of my mother, who was an avid gardener. She created beautiful gardens with a sense of place. For her, the garden was not a place to look at, but to move and live in. That is what landscaping is all about. It's not easy, and it is work, especially in Kansas where it will turn hot and dry. But there are enough examples of beautiful gardens to encourage us. There's Botanica in Wichita. We have the garden here on campus. Oh yes, it does take work, and those public gardens have maintenance staff. You have to, or you won't have a colorful garden. The harder thing for many people is several things. They do not know plant material. But just like babies, the plants grow and need space. Of course, they like good soil, but some plants will do quite well in less good soil. But we can improve soil. However, if you have poor soil, accept it and don't fight it. But be smart and select hardy plant material which will thrive. I don't think I've ever seen the old-fashioned Van Hoot spirea fail. A few days ago, I spent the best part of the day pruning existing plants. All we did was carefully shape them up. No, we did not shear them. By the end of the day, the big yard looked better. Oh, we are not done yet. There's a lot more to do. I marked shrubs which should be dug up and moved and planted in such a way to make a garden statement. Replanted, they will start to define a space. That is what landscaping is. Defining spaces, using plant material for separation. Just think windbreak or shelter belt. You're on this side or on the other side. But now think of a row of deciduous trees with limbs trimmed up. You can see and walk through it. It still separates, but not as rigid. But what if you planted a row of shrubs, formal, or a hedge, informal shrub border? What about a large bed of ground cover as separation? What if you laid flagstone through it as a path to the clothesline? And that, by the way, was another photo in a small booklet. To see people happy with the advice and suggestions given is rewarding. But to receive the result after so many years with a collection of photos and handwritten notes is special. Thanks.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That'll do it for our Wednesday edition. As always, we appreciate you tuning in and welcome you right back here this same time tomorrow. Until then, and for Britton Rucker, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.